I've been saying for about a year that I thought new taxes would come in, and the G7 have announced a so-called global minimum tax. What is it, and what could this mean in the future? That's going to be the topic of today's video. Now, the G7 nations have agreed to keep their corporate tax at 15% or higher. Now, it's an early stage of this. The G7 isn't what it used to be. They need to get an agreement at the G20 and the OECD realistically to get this through. It isn't 100% sure to go through because also the Biden administration and others need to get it through domestically. However, it seems to be the case that they're targeting about 100 of the world's biggest companies that are multinationals, that have profit margins above 10%. And what they're saying is they're not going to be able to shift those profits to low tax jurisdictions like Ireland and some others. And in addition to that, if they do that, it can be topped up. So for example, let's say if Amazon or another big company, I'm going to come back to Amazon later on, but let's say they move their profits to Ireland, which has 12.5% corporate tax, then the host country could top up the tax by 2.5%. So the rules wouldn't stop countries like the Cayman Islands or Ireland having 0% tax, but what they would allow is for those countries to top up those taxes. And it would ensure that, say, the US, UK, Japan can't lower their corporate tax to less than 15% unless they kind of renege on the agreement or get out of the agreement. However, it seems to be just on the 100 biggest and most profitable companies. So for example, Amazon, believe it or not, even though it's one of the most profitable companies, because each product is typically sold at not that much profit, and also they reinvest a lot of their money, Amazon actually doesn't have 10% profit margins. They sell so many products, but they don't have the kind of profit margins, for example, Apple has on the iPhone. So what I think is campaigners are going to say, well, this is not enough. They're already saying that, right? It will never be enough for some people. So this is going to be just one move of many. It could extend to other companies as well, because one thing I would say about this agreement, as many people know from listening to my content or following my content on our channels, I'm against this kind of agreement because I think one thing could lead to another. However, if it doesn't lead to one thing to another, at least this agreement only targets about 100 companies. It's only the multinationals, but eventually we might start to see, for example, all companies targeted. So if you're a British person living in the UK and you want to move yourself to the UAE, move your family, set up a business locally, you might also be targeted. The government might say, hold on, you're a British citizen, you're moving to Dubai, even though you're not offshoring your products, you're just starting a completely fresh company. No, I'm sorry, you have to pay to your home country. It could have other ramifications. We might have a global minimum income tax that would affect expats around the world who have moved to places like the UAE or Qatar or whatever. If that happens, it would be awful. But if it just stays as it is, I will say one thing, at least it's only going to be on the multinationals and the biggest multinationals. And it will be more enforceable that way because it's easier just to check on a small number of firms. Because if you think about it, how could you possibly do the due diligence on, say, millions of firms around the world to ensure they're not lowering their taxes in a kind of legal way? So that's the only good thing I think about this agreement. But what I worry about is this could lead to other things. And what will happen almost for sure is this. Number one, there's going to be moral hazards that are going to be caused. Unexpected things are going to come. So in the same way that when the banks were more regulated, all that happened was those kind of banks amalgamated together, they became too big to fail. Whenever new regulations are brought in, there's always unexpected consequences, there's always legal loopholes, and then you're always chasing to ensure you close down those loopholes. So even though the propaganda is, oh, this is going to hurt Apple, this is going to hurt Facebook, interestingly, these big companies have actually came out and supported this initiative. Now you might say, well, that's because they saw the writing on the wall, but I suspect deep down that they know that not only will this provide certainty, but there'll be ways they can get around this, and it will probably affect smaller firms more. I can remember in 2014 when the FATCA was brought in, the propaganda was, oh, this is going to affect big American companies overseas, because basically the FATCA is the foreign tax compliance on US companies and individuals. Basically, if you're a bank now and you hold the money of Americans or a brokerage, you have to report to the US government. So say if you're an American individual with a bank account in the UK, Germany, Cayman, Belarus, all those institutions have to report back to the US government. So it's actually on the watch of the institutions. They have to do it. Now, a lot of people said, oh, this is going to be targeting Apple and the big boys. What happened? The big boys just hired a few more compliance people. It actually affected middle class Americans more, the kind of people who had $250,000. They didn't bother to file, then they got fines and whatever. I suspect there's a chance that these kind of agreements eventually will not hurt the big boys. Yes, they might have to pay a bit more in tax bill, just hire a few more compliance people, they'll find their ways around it, or they will comply. But the smaller firms, if this eventually becomes all the companies, will not be able to deal with that kind of thing. So long term, I actually don't think this will harm the biggest companies. That's just the propaganda around this. And what worries me is that one thing could lead to another, and you could have many global minimum taxes. So what starts as a global minimum corporate tax on a few corporates will become a global minimum corporate tax for everyone. Then that will lead to even people who are not trying to shift their profits but want to start new companies having to pay tax to their home country. For example, if an expat moves from country to country, then global minimum income taxes, global minimum capital gains taxes, and so on and so forth. So let's hope it doesn't come to that, because this agreement could be the start of many things. How can I help you? In two ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfayed.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.